How do I tell my boyfriend I'm in love with our baby's biological father? My boyfriend paid his best friend to make love with me. We'd been trying for a baby for 2 years before we got told Ryan was infertile. We were financially stable and desperate, and his best friend Noah was broke and looked similar to my boyfriend. When Ryan suggested it, I just shrugged, not knowing if he was serious. But then the next day he called Noah over, and Noah agreed immediately. Whatever you guys need, this is your baby, I'm just helping. We agreed that Noah would receive $5,000, have no parental rights, and Ryan would be on the birth certificate. They shook hands. After some thought, I also agreed. When it came time for the actual process, Noah was painfully respectful. He held my hand, looked only at my eyes, and afterwards kissed my forehead gently, before leaving the room so Ryan could come in. No jokes, no awkwardness, just quiet dignity that made the whole thing bearable. When the first test came back positive, Ryan cried happy tears and made his lock screen a photo of the ultrasound. Ryan's friends made crude comments about the arrangement, but Noah shut them down immediately. For months, everything went according to plan. We were winning at this arrangement. Then the 20-week anatomy scan revealed we were having a boy. Ryan's hand tightened on mine as he stared at the screen. Will he look more like Noah than me? The question hung in the air while the technician cheerfully pointed out tiny fingers and toes. That night, I found him crying in the nursery at 3 a.m., holding the ultrasound photo. The guilt crushed me. When Noah stopped by to drop off groceries the following week, he found me sobbing at the kitchen table. Ryan thinks the baby already looks like you in the ultrasounds. I managed between tears. Noah set down the bag slowly. Then Ryan needs glasses. This is his son, not mine. Everything got worse when the pregnancy weight came. By 24 weeks, I'd gained 30 pounds and Ryan stopped touching me entirely. One night, struggling to zip a dress for his company dinner, he watched from the doorway. Look at yourself. You've turned into a whale. The baby doesn't need you eating for 3. He laughed, actually stepping back from me. I can't bring you to this dinner looking like that. What would people think? The words hit like physical blows. He left for the dinner alone while I sobbed into my pillow, feeling disgusting. When Noah came by the next week with groceries Ryan had forgotten to buy, he found me crying over my laptop, reading about pregnancy weight gain. Ryan said I'm getting too big, I whispered, ashamed to even say it aloud. Noah's jaw tightened. Ryan's being dumb. You're growing a human. You're supposed to gain weight. You look healthy and beautiful. Ryan started drinking more after that company dinner. 3 beers became 6, then whiskey straight from the bottle. He'd pass out on the couch most nights, avoiding our bedroom entirely. When I had doctor's appointments, he'd promise to meet me there but show up late, reeking of alcohol, or not at all. Traffic was brutal. He'd slur, even at 10 a.m. appointments. I started lying to Noah when he asked how things were going, but he seemed to know anyway. At 32 weeks, I woke to stabbing pain and a lot of blood. I called Ryan first. Something's wrong with the baby. In the background, I could make out noise from a bar. Can't you just drive yourself? I'm with clients. Beep. He hung up. I called 911, then Noah, who found me on the bathroom floor, blood everywhere. I'm losing the baby, I sobbed. We're going to the hospital. He ran every red light, one hand gripping mine while I cramped and bled. 4 hours later, the doctor delivered the news. Threatened miscarriage, but the baby was stable. When they asked about contacting the father, Noah was already in the doorway. Ryan showed up 6 hours later, still drunk, cologne failing to mask the bar smell. Sorry, babe, my phone died. Noah stood up slowly, fists clenched. She almost lost the baby. Your baby. Ryan laughed bitterly. My baby? Everyone knows whose baby it really is. The next 2 weeks on bed rest revealed everything. Ryan would leave for work, but post Instagram stories from clubs. Noah came every day with meals, sat quietly while I rested, cleaned without being asked, never crossed a single boundary. When I finally broke down about Ryan's drinking, the baby kicked hard, and Noah's face transformed with wonder when I placed his hand on my belly. Suddenly, for the first time in days, Ryan appeared in the doorway. What the hell is this? His words slurred. Noah stood, still holding my hand. I'm taking care of what you won't. Ryan laughed. He stumbled into the kitchen and I heard glass shatter. The sound of breaking glass made me jump and Noah moved fast, putting himself between me and the kitchen doorway. Ryan came stumbling back into the room with glass pieces stuck to his shoes, his face red and twisted with anger. He pointed at Noah with a shaky finger. You think I'm stupid? You think I don't know what's really going on here? Noah kept his hand on my arm, steady and calm. Ryan, you need to calm down. Ryan laughed, but it came out mean and bitter. Don't tell me what to do in my own house. He took another step forward and almost tripped over his own feet. The smell of whiskey was so strong it made my stomach turn. That's my name on the birth certificate, but we all know whose baby it really is. My hands went to my belly as the baby kicked hard, like he could feel the stress. Noah didn't move from his spot between us. You're drunk, and you're scaring her. Ryan's eyes got wild. Scaring her? She's the one letting you touch her belly like you're the real father. I grabbed my phone with shaking hands and started dialing my doctor's emergency number while Noah kept Ryan back. The nurse answered on the 3rd ring and I tried to keep my voice steady. This is Sarah from Dr. Klein's practice. I'm 33 weeks and there's a situation at home. My boyfriend is drunk and yelling and I had that threatened miscarriage last week. She didn't hesitate. "You need to come in right now for monitoring." Ryan heard me and started yelling louder. "You don't need to go anywhere. This is between us." Noah took my elbow and started guiding me toward the door. "I'm taking her to the hospital." Ryan tried to follow but stumbled into the wall. We made it to Noah's car and I could barely get my seatbelt on because my hands were shaking so bad. The drive to the hospital felt like forever, even though Noah was going way over the speed limit. At the emergency room, they took me straight back and started hooking me up to all these monitors. The baby's heartbeat filled the room, strong and steady, but my blood pressure numbers kept climbing higher. A man in a button-down shirt came in and introduced himself as Fabian Hines from Social Services. He pulled up a chair next to my bed and his voice was really gentle. "The nurses told me there was an incident at home. Can you tell me what happened?" I told him everything while the monitors beeped around us. He took notes and asked careful questions about how often Ryan drank and if he'd ever gotten physical before. "We need to talk about keeping you and your baby safe." My phone started buzzing nonstop on the bedside table. Ryan's name kept lighting up the screen. The first texts were all angry, calling Noah names and saying I was trying to steal his family. Then they switched to begging me to come home and saying he was sorry. Then back to angry again. After the 20th message, I turned the phone off completely. I told the nurse at the desk that if a man named Ryan showed up, they shouldn't let him in my room. She made a note in my chart and said security would handle it. They kept me overnight for observation, and Fabian came back in the morning with a folder full of papers. My blood pressure had finally come down, but he said we needed to make a plan before I went home. He gave me pamphlets about domestic violence and wrote his direct phone number on a business card. "This is for emergencies, day or night." He helped me fill out forms for something called a safety plan, asking about places I could go if things got bad again and people I could call for help. We talked about protective orders and what that would mean. My hands were shaking as I held all the papers he gave me. Noah drove me home the next morning and Ryan was sitting on the porch steps, looking gray and sick from his hangover. His eyes were all red and puffy like he'd been crying. Noah stayed in the car with the engine running while I walked up. Ryan stood up fast. "Baby, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean any of it. The drinking just got out of control, but I'll stop. I promise. Just please don't leave me." I stayed by the car door. "You need to prove you're serious about getting sober before we can even talk about the future." He started crying harder. "I'll do anything. I'll go to meetings. I'll pour out all the alcohol. Just come inside." I shook my head. "I need some time to think." Noah drove me to my sister's place and I used her computer to look up therapists. I found Hannah Ladd, who specialized in pregnancy problems and relationship stuff. My finger hovered over the call button for a long time because calling felt like admitting how messed up everything had gotten. But I made the appointment for 3 days later. That evening I was lying on my sister's couch when she showed me her phone. Luke Otero had tagged Ryan in an Instagram story, and there he was at a bar. Bottles everywhere. Clearly drunk again just hours after promising to quit. My heart just sank. All those promises this morning meant nothing. I texted Noah that I needed help finding a real place to stay because I couldn't go back home. The next morning, I met Fabian at the courthouse. My hands were shaking. So bad I could barely hold the pen to fill out the protective order paperwork. I had to write down everything that had been happening. The drinking, the cruel comments about my weight, leaving me alone during the miscarriage scare, and now the confrontation with the broken glass. The judge read through everything and granted it right away based on my pregnancy and all the proof of Ryan's drinking. Fabian said someone named Ronan Gates would serve Ryan with the papers. That afternoon, my phone started going crazy with voicemails. Ronan must have given Ryan the papers because each message sounded worse than the one before. "You can't do this to me. That's my baby. I'll demand a paternity test. I'll take him away from you. Noah put you up to this, didn't he? I know what you two are doing. You think you can just cut me out? I have rights." Each voicemail got louder and more unhinged until I was scared to even listen to them anymore. I turned my phone off completely and called Diane Meyer the next morning, the lawyer Fabian had recommended. Her office was small but organized, with thick folders everywhere and a whiteboard covered in case notes. She sat across from me with a legal pad, writing down everything while I explained about the arrangement with Noah and Ryan's name being on all the paperwork for when the baby came. She looked up from her notes. "Ryan's obligations exist regardless of biology since he's claiming paternity." She pulled out a binder full of similar cases and showed me how courts handle these situations. The biological facts didn't matter as much as who was taking legal responsibility, and Ryan had already signed everything saying he was the father. She made copies of all my documents, the texts about the arrangement, the bank statements showing our joint finances, everything that proved Ryan's role. Her assistant scheduled our next meeting while Diane filed paperwork for emergency support since I couldn't access our money. Walking out of her office, my phone buzzed with a text from Noah saying he'd keep helping with groceries, but needed to be careful about boundaries now that lawyers were involved. He didn't want to give Ryan any ammunition for court by looking too involved. I sat in my car reading his message over and over, understanding his position but feeling more alone than I'd felt since this whole mess started. 3 days later, I had my first appointment with Hannah Ladd, the therapist Fabian had suggested. Her office smelled like vanilla candles and had soft chairs that made me sink in when I sat down. She handed me tissues before I even started crying, which happened about 2 minutes into explaining everything. We spent that whole first session just naming what had been happening, using words I'd been too scared to say out loud like emotional abuse and neglect and escalation. She wrote notes while I talked about Ryan's drinking and the weight comments and leaving me alone during the bleeding. She helped me see that protecting the baby meant protecting myself first, that they weren't separate things like I'd been thinking. The next week at my 34-week checkup, I was sitting in the waiting room when Ryan pushed through the doors, demanding to see me even though the protective order said he couldn't come near me. The receptionist called security immediately while I ran to an exam room and locked the door. I could hear him yelling in the hallway about his rights as the father while 2 security guards escorted him out. The nurse checked my blood pressure 3 times because it kept spiking higher and higher. They made me lie on my left side for an hour until it came down enough to be safe. The doctor wanted to admit me, but I convinced her I'd be okay if I went straight home to rest. That night, I tried to buy groceries online, but my card got declined. I checked our bank account and found Ryan had frozen everything, even the account with my paycheck deposits. The grocery app kept rejecting my payment while I tried different cards, all linked to the same frozen accounts. I called Diane immediately, and she filed emergency paperwork with the court, but she warned me it would take at least 3 days to get a hearing about the money. I had $40 cash in my wallet and a nearly empty fridge. Noah could only drop off groceries once that week because his work schedule had gotten crazy with some big project deadline. He left bags on my doorstep with a note saying he was sorry he couldn't help more, but didn't want things to look wrong for court. I started taking Ubers to my appointments because I couldn't afford gas, watching the fare add up on my phone and wondering how long my cash would last. During my next session with Hannah, we worked on creating a birth plan that would keep Ryan away unless he could prove he was sober and had permission from the court. She helped me write down exactly what I wanted, who could be there, what would happen if Ryan showed up anyway. We called the hospital together and they added security notes to my file, highlighting the protective order and the safety concerns. The charge nurse said they dealt with situations like this and would keep me safe. The hospital security would have Ryan's photo at all entrance points. 2 days later, Ryan's office called asking why he hadn't been at work for a week. For the first time ever, I didn't make up an excuse or cover for him. He's dealing with personal issues. Here's his cell number. The woman on the phone sounded confused since I'd always handled his sick calls before, but I hung up before she could ask questions. Finally, Diane called with good news about the emergency hearing. The judge had ordered temporary support and given me exclusive use of our house while Ryan had to stay with Luke. She read parts of the ruling over the phone, how the judge was concerned about Ryan's behavior and my advanced pregnancy, how he'd have to pay support immediately. I could move back home the next day, and Ryan couldn't come within 500 feet. That evening, Noah stopped by for just a few minutes to drop off some mail that had gone to his place by mistake. He stood at the door, not coming inside, and cleared his throat awkwardly. I need to be clear about something. I care about you and the baby being okay, but I can't be more than a supportive friend. He looked at his shoes while explaining he'd started seeing someone casually and wanted to be transparent about it. My chest tightened, but I nodded and thanked him for being honest, even though it stung more than I expected it would. 3 days later, I found a huge flower arrangement on my doorstep, with a card in Ryan's handwriting saying he was sorry for everything and begging me to call him. The delivery slip showed it came from the expensive florist downtown and must have cost at least $200. I took photos of everything, including the order number, and texted them to Diane, who immediately filed a violation report with the court. Hannah helped me see this wasn't real remorse, but just Ryan trying to manipulate me back under his control by throwing money at the problem instead of doing actual work on himself. She explained how people with addiction often cycle through these grand gestures when they feel their control slipping away. I packed the flowers in a box and left them on the curb for trash pickup, while Hannah watched through video chat to make sure I didn't weaken and bring them inside. That same week, I signed up for online Al-Anon meetings after Hannah suggested it might help me understand what was happening with Ryan. The first meeting was hard because I kept wanting to defend him, or explain why his drinking wasn't that bad until other people started sharing their stories. One woman talked about how she spent 10 years making excuses for her husband's drinking before realizing she was just enabling him to avoid consequences. Another person described the exact same promises Ryan made about getting help, and how they never lasted more than a few days. I learned about the 3 C's, which meant I didn't cause his drinking. I couldn't control it, and I couldn't cure it. The meetings helped me stop blaming myself for not being enough to make him want to stay sober for our baby. At 36 weeks, I woke up with my belly rock hard and pain shooting across my lower back every few minutes. My blood pressure monitor showed numbers way higher than normal, and I could feel my heart racing even lying down. The contractions kept coming closer together, and I called my doctor, who told me to get to the hospital immediately. I grabbed my hospital bag and called an Uber since Noah was at work, and I didn't want to wait. They hooked me up to monitors right away and started IV medications to stop the contractions while checking if I was dilated. The nurse kept adjusting the monitors because the baby's heart rate would dip during each contraction and then shoot back up. After 4 hours, the medications finally worked, and the contractions spaced out, then stopped completely, but my blood pressure stayed high. The doctor decided to keep me overnight for observation, and said we might need to deliver early if things didn't improve. I spent the night watching the monitors and realizing how alone I'd be when real labor started without anyone to hold my hand or advocate for me. The next morning, I was putting on my shoes to leave when Ryan appeared in the hospital lobby wearing a suit like he'd come from a job interview. He rushed toward me saying he'd been checking every hospital trying to find me and swearing he'd already signed up for rehab if I'd just let him be there when the baby came. Security stepped between us immediately since the staff had my protective order on file, but Ryan kept talking over them about how he deserved to see his son born. I told him if he was serious about rehab, he needed to actually enroll first, and show proof through our lawyers, not just make more empty promises. He started crying and saying I was being cruel keeping him from his child, but security escorted him out while he shouted about getting his lawyer involved. 2 days later, Diane forwarded an email with documentation showing Ryan had enrolled in an outpatient program that met 3 evenings a week. The intake form showed he'd admitted to drinking daily, and had his first session scheduled for that night. But Diane and I both knew outpatient wasn't enough for someone drinking as much as Ryan. I told her all communication needed to stay between attorneys, and that he'd need to complete the full program, plus show sustained sobriety, before I'd consider any changes to our arrangement. She agreed and said the court would likely require at least 90 days of documented sobriety before modifying any custody orders. We spent the next few hours drafting a temporary parenting plan that would let Ryan have supervised visits at a family visitation center after the baby was born, but only if he stayed sober and completed his treatment. The plan included drug and alcohol testing requirements, and specified that any failed test would immediately suspend visits until he completed additional treatment. Diane said judges usually approve these kinds of graduated plans because they gave parents chances to prove themselves while keeping babies safe. The facility would provide trained supervisors who would document all interactions and stop visits if anything concerning happened. I went to the hospital the next week to pre-register for delivery and met with their security team about my situation. They took Ryan's photo from social media and added it to their system with notes about the protective order and that he wasn't allowed in the maternity ward. The security supervisor walked me through their procedures and showed me the panic buttons in every room that would bring security immediately. They flagged my file so every staff member would know about the safety concerns and promised someone would check my room regularly during labor. Hannah helped me create detailed plans for going into labor, including having 911 on speed dial and keeping my packed hospital bag right by the front door. We practiced the fastest route to the hospital and identified backup routes in case of traffic while timing how long each one took. She had me write down exactly what I'd say to 911 and practice saying it out loud so I wouldn't freeze if I was in pain. We made lists of what to do if labor started at different times of day and who to call in what order. During my next therapy session, I finally said out loud what I'd been thinking for weeks, that I didn't want Ryan back even if he got completely sober. Hannah asked me to explain more, and I told her how the mean things he'd said about my body and abandoning me during the bleeding had broken something that couldn't be fixed. I just wanted him stable enough to be a safe co-parent, but I'd never trust him as a partner again after seeing who he became when things got hard. She said this clarity would help with all the legal proceedings because I could focus on what was best for the baby instead of trying to save a relationship that was already over. The next week we had another hearing where the judge reviewed everything that had happened, including the flower violation and Ryan's enrollment in outpatient treatment. The judge ordered temporary child support starting immediately based on Ryan's last known income and said he had to maintain the payments even if he lost his job from drinking. She kept the no-contact order in place except for communication through attorneys and said Ryan needed at least 30 days of verified treatment before she'd even consider revisiting custody arrangements. The support amount was enough to cover my basic expenses, which meant I could stop panicking about money and focus on getting ready for the baby. That night after my shower, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror for the first time in weeks and really looked at my body without clothes on. My belly was huge and covered in stretch marks that looked like purple lightning bolts spreading across my skin. I touched each mark gently and whispered thank you to my body for growing this baby even when everything else was falling apart. Hannah had taught me these exercises during our last session, where I was supposed to say nice things to myself instead of mean ones. I told my legs thank you for carrying all this extra weight, and my back, thank you for not giving out even though it hurt all the time. The next morning, Diane called me with news that made my stomach drop. Luke had posted Instagram stories at 2 a.m. showing Ryan passed out on his couch with empty beer bottles all around him. She'd already taken screenshots before Luke deleted them 20 minutes later, but the damage was done. We filed an update with the court that afternoon showing Ryan had broken his promise to stay sober, and the judge immediately canceled any talks about him getting visits with the baby. Noah came by that weekend to put together the crib I'd ordered online since I couldn't figure out the instructions myself. He worked quietly in the nursery while I sat in the rocking chair watching him sort through all the pieces and screws. When he finished 2 hours later, I asked if he wanted to stay for dinner, but he grabbed his tools and headed for the door. "I can't," he said without looking back, and I understood even though it hurt to watch him leave so fast. My next doctor's appointment brought more changes when she checked my blood pressure 3 times and frowned at the numbers. The baby was measuring big on the ultrasound, and my blood pressure kept going up no matter what I did. She pulled out her calendar and pointed to a date that was only 10 days away. "We're going to schedule your induction for 37 weeks and 2 days, she said while typing notes into her computer. Having an actual date written down made everything feel more real and less scary somehow. I called Diane from the parking lot to tell her about the induction date, and she said she'd make sure the court knew in case Ryan tried anything. Then I called Fabian, who promised to alert hospital security about the specific date so they'd be ready. The hospital added extra notes to my file and said they'd have someone stationed near the maternity ward entrance that whole day. 3 days before the induction, I was packing my hospital bag when my phone rang with a blocked number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up, and Ryan's voice came through slurred and crying. He talked for 5 minutes straight about how his dad used to hit him when he was little, and how he swore he'd never be like that, but here he was turning into the same kind of dad. "I'm so sorry for everything," he kept saying over and over until I hung up and saved the voicemail for Diane to add to our court file. The night before my induction, I couldn't sleep at all and just walked around the apartment checking my bag over and over. At 4:30 in the morning, Noah knocked on my door wearing jeans and a hoodie with his car keys in his hand. The drive to the hospital took 20 minutes, and he held my hand the whole way while I tried not to throw up from nerves. When we got to the maternity ward, he squeezed my fingers once and then went to sit in the waiting room while the nurses took me back. They got me into a hospital gown and hooked up all the monitors before starting the medicine to make labor begin. For the first 4 hours, nothing happened except mild cramps that felt like period pain. Then suddenly the contractions got stronger. But when the doctor checked me, I was barely dilated at all. 6 more hours passed with contractions coming every few minutes, but my body wasn't cooperating. The nurse kept adjusting the medicine dose while I gripped the bed rails and tried to breathe through each wave of pain. By hour 10, I was exhausted and crying from the pain, so I asked for an epidural even though I'd wanted to do it without drugs. The anesthesiologist came quickly, and within 20 minutes the pain was mostly gone, but then the loneliness hit hard. Other rooms had partners coaching and holding hands, but I was alone except for the nurse who came in every 30 minutes to check the monitors. I focused on the only thing that mattered, which was meeting my baby, and pushed all the sad feelings away. Around midnight, things finally started moving faster, and the doctor said I was ready to start pushing soon. But then alarms started going off, and suddenly my room filled with people in scrubs moving really fast. The baby's heart rate had dropped too low and wasn't coming back up quickly enough. The doctor explained they might need to use forceps or vacuum to help get him out faster. I was so scared but nodded and did exactly what they told me to do. When they said push, I pushed harder than I'd ever pushed in my life, even though I couldn't feel much because of the epidural. After what felt like forever, but was really only 20 minutes, I heard the most beautiful sound as my son started crying. They put him on my chest all wet and squirmy while I sobbed and touched his tiny fingers and toes. He weighed 7 pounds and 8 ounces with a full head of dark hair and the tiniest little nose. The nurse brought over the birth certificate paperwork, and I signed it with shaking hands, putting Ryan's name as the father, just like we'd agreed legally. The next morning, Fabian knocked on my hospital room door and told me Ryan was downstairs asking to see the baby. My whole body went tight, but Fabian explained he'd already talked to security, and Ryan understood it would be a supervised visit in my room with Fabian staying the whole time. I looked at my son sleeping in the plastic bassinet and nodded because legally Ryan had rights even with the protective order modified for this. 20 minutes later, Ryan walked in looking like death with bags under his eyes and his hands shaking slightly. Fabian stood by the door watching while Ryan approached the bassinet slowly, like he was scared to get too close. When he picked up our son, his whole face changed, and tears started rolling down his cheeks as he held him against his chest. He whispered promises to the baby about getting better and being the dad he deserved while I watched from the bed, feeling my heart crack open. The baby stayed calm in his arms, and Ryan rocked him gently for the full hour Fabian had approved. When the time was up, Ryan carefully put him back in the bassinet and turned to me with this desperate look. He asked if he could come home with us tomorrow and help with everything, but I shook my head and reminded him about the supervised visitation plan we'd already agreed to through lawyers. He needed to prove sustained sobriety first, and we both knew that meant completing a program and staying clean for months, not days. Ryan nodded without arguing and kissed the baby's forehead before Fabian walked him out. The next day, Noah showed up right when they were processing my discharge papers and helped load all the flowers and bags into his car. He drove carefully while I sat in the back with the baby in his car seat watching every tiny movement. At my apartment, Noah carried everything inside in 3 trips and set up the bassinet next to my bed exactly where I pointed. He asked to see the baby up close, and I lifted him out of the car seat so Noah could look at his face for maybe 10 seconds. Noah smiled and said he looked healthy, then headed for the door saying he'd check in later. That first night alone with my son was the scariest thing I'd ever done. He cried every 2 hours, and I fumbled with diapers and swaddles trying to remember everything the nurses had shown me. By morning, we'd figured out a rhythm where he'd eat then sleep on my chest while I dozed sitting up against pillows. The first week disappeared in a blur of no sleep and constant feeding and diaper changes. My nipples cracked and bled from nursing, and I cried from exhaustion and pain every single day. Hannah called for our scheduled video session, and I answered while the baby was latched on because that was the only time he wasn't screaming. She could see how tired I was and reminded me that keeping a newborn alive while dealing with everything else made me amazing, even if I didn't feel it. She helped me see that just getting through each day was enough right now. By day 10, the nursing pain was unbearable, and I was crying more than the baby. I bought formula at the drugstore and made a bottle with shaking hands, feeling like a failure. But when he drank it eagerly and fell asleep with a full belly, I realized fed was best, and my mental health mattered too. I kept nursing a few times a day, but supplemented with formula, and suddenly everything felt more manageable. 2 weeks after birth, Diane forwarded me a text from Ryan with admission paperwork for a 30-day inpatient rehab program starting the next day. The screenshot showed his name on the intake forms and the facility's confirmation email. I felt a tiny spark of hope, but stayed focused on getting through each day with the baby. Diane helped me file for legal separation the following week, with all the paperwork citing Ryan's alcohol abuse and the protective order and documentation of his neglect during my pregnancy. The papers felt heavy in my hands as I signed them, knowing divorce would follow, but needing to protect myself and my son legally right now. We discussed the baby's last name and decided to keep it as Ryan since he was on the birth certificate, and changing it would create complications for insurance and legal custody later. It was purely practical, but still felt strange writing Ryan's last name on doctor forms for a baby he'd barely met. Noah started texting instead of calling, and his check-ins went from every few days to once a week. He'd ask if we needed anything, and I'd usually say no even when we did, because maintaining distance felt important for everyone. When he did stop by, it was always quick, with him dropping off diapers or groceries on the porch and leaving after a brief wave through the window. 2 months passed in a fog of sleepless nights and endless laundry, and finally the day came for Ryan's first official supervised visit. The family center was a plain building with toys and cameras in every room. Ryan looked different after 30 days, impatient with clear eyes and steady hands. He sat on the floor mat while the supervisor watched and played with our son for the full hour, making silly faces and reading board books. The baby smiled at him, and Ryan looked at me through the observation window with tears in his eyes. He followed every rule without complaint, and thanked the supervisor when time was up. The weeks started blending together after that first visit, but I found my rhythm with feedings every 3 hours and naps when the baby slept. One morning, while scrolling Facebook during a feeding, I saw a post about a mom's group meeting at the community center every Tuesday. I bundled the baby into his car seat the next Tuesday and drove there with my diaper bag packed full of supplies. The room had about 8 women sitting in a circle with babies on blankets, and Phoebe introduced herself as the group leader. She had twin boys crawling around and made everyone feel welcome by asking about our babies without prying into personal stuff. We talked about sleep schedules and teething and which diapers leaked the least, and nobody asked about the dad situation. I went back every week after that, and finally had people who understood why I was excited about 4 straight hours of sleep. The court date for finalizing our separation came 3 weeks later, and I sat in the courtroom while Diane presented our agreement. Ryan sat on the other side with his lawyer, and we didn't make eye contact the whole time. The judge reviewed everything, including Ryan's completion of rehab and current residence in sober housing. She approved supervised visits twice weekly at the family center and ordered child support of $800 monthly. Ryan had gotten a job at a warehouse, and the money would come straight from his paycheck. The gavel came down, and just like that, we were legally separated with custody arrangements official. When the baby turned 3 months old, I started looking at daycares near my office. My boss had agreed to let me come back part-time and work from home 2 days a week. The daycare I picked had cameras I could check from my phone, and the teachers seemed genuinely caring. That first drop-off took forever because I kept going back to check if he was okay. By the second week, I had our morning routine down with bottles made the night before and his bag always packed. I'd drop him at 7:30 and pick him up at 1, then work from home while he napped. Each successful day made me feel more capable of handling this single mom thing. Ryan hit 90 days sober right before the baby turned 4 months old. Diane forwarded me the certificate from his program and documentation from his sponsor. The next court hearing approved unsupervised daytime visits starting with 4 hours every Saturday. Through Diane, he sent a card thanking me for not completely cutting him off and promising to keep working his program. I didn't respond, but I kept the card in the baby's memory box. A week later, I got mail from Noah with no return address. Inside was a congratulations card for the baby turning 4 months with a check for $500. He'd signed it, "Your friend," and written that it was for the baby's college fund. I noticed his handwriting looked different, more confident somehow, and Diane mentioned he'd gotten promoted to management at his company. The first unsupervised visit happened at a McDonald's with a playground. Ryan showed up 5 minutes early, and I had everything packed in the diaper bag. We actually managed to talk about the baby's eating schedule and nap times without any tension. He asked about teething remedies, and I told him about the frozen washcloths that helped. We weren't friends, but we were functioning as parents. 5 months had passed since that night with the broken glass when I watched through the window at the family center. Ryan was on the floor making the baby laugh with peekaboo and silly faces. The baby grabbed his nose and Ryan pretended to sneeze, which made them both crack up. He'd been sober 120 days, and it showed in his clear eyes and steady hands. Our son was healthy and growing and hitting all his milestones. That evening, after putting the baby down, I sat in the rocking chair Noah had assembled months ago. The nursery walls still had the decals he'd helped me put up, and the crib he'd built stood solid and safe. Looking around the room, I felt something I hadn't felt in so long. Not happiness exactly, but hope that we'd all found our way to better places, even if nothing went how we'd planned it. This whole thing really has been a journey. Thanks for sticking around with me through all the questions and wondering. If you made it to the end, drop a comment. I love reading all your comments.